August 17, 1943, East Prussia. Inside the reinforced underground command bunker of the Luftwaffe's Operational Directorate, General Oberst Hans Gischonek, the Chief of Staff of Germany's Air Force, pressed his fingertips against a table covered with reconnaissance photographs. The fluorescent lights above flickered with the unstable hum of overworked generators, illuminating the silent faces of senior officers who had gathered to evaluate the morning's events. Behind Jeschonek stood General Adolf Galland, the hard-edged inspector of fighter forces, a cigar smoldering between his fingers, his expression caught somewhere between irritation and disbelief. Spread across the table were the latest aerial images taken by the He-111 reconnaissance crew at dawn. They depicted something that even the most pessimistic intelligence analysts in Berlin had refused to believe was possible just 24 hours earlier. The total destruction of the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the smoke-choked ruins of Regensburg's aircraft facilities, two industrial centers considered critical to the Reich's war machine. Entire production halls had collapsed into twisted metal. Storage depots had burned to their foundations. Machine tools worth millions had been reduced to unrecognizable slag. Jeschonek looked up slowly, his voice razor-thin as he addressed his staff. This level of precision, at this altitude, how is it possible? No one answered. The photographs told the truth more clearly than any briefing ever could. The American B-17, Flying Fortress, a bomber the Luftwaffe had mocked for years as slow, clumsy, and naively over-engineered, had just demonstrated a capability that German commanders had insisted could not exist. A deep strike into the heart of Bavaria, executed in daylight, without fighter escort for most of the journey. And still the formations had reached their targets, dropped their bombs with terrifying accuracy, and escaped with fewer losses than German planners had predicted. Galland, who had been skeptical of American air doctrine since the first B-17 wreck fell into German hands in 1942, exhaled a long plume of smoke and whispered almost to himself, "This changes the war." But neither he nor Jeschonek yet understood just how profoundly. Because what happened on August 17, 1943, was not merely a successful bombing raid. It was a signal, a demonstration of industrial might, logistical preparation, and aerial engineering, on a scale the German command staff had never fully imagined. It was the opening chapter of a campaign that would eventually turn the skies over Germany into a battleground of fire and steel, a systematic demolition of the Reich's industrial spine, and the psychological collapse of a leadership that believed strategic bombing could never break them. What the Luftwaffe's officers were about to learn in the weeks, months, and years ahead was that the B-17 was not simply an aircraft. It was a factory-built cathedral of aluminum and firepower, a four-engine embodiment of a continent-sized industrial economy, and the spearhead of a doctrine Germany had refused to take seriously, until it was too late. That morning, as Jeschonek scanned the photographs again, his hand trembled. For months, he had assured Göring and the political leadership in Berlin that American strategic aviation was a bluff, an expensive but tactically misguided experiment that would collapse under attrition. He had argued that no bomber could survive deep daylight penetration into German airspace, that formation flying was outdated, that heavily armed aircraft lacked maneuverability, and that American crews would panic when confronted by coordinated German fighter attacks. But the images on the table showed something different. The factories were gone, the cities were burning, and the B-17s had come, dropped their bombs, and left, just as they would again, and again, and again. For the first time since the war began, senior Luftwaffe officers were forced to confront a terrible realization. Germany had built a powerful air force, but the United States had built an air industry. And in industrial war, factories matter more than bravery. Galland leaned over the images, measuring bomb craters with a small ruler, checking for consistency, dispersion, and accuracy. The results were worse than expected. The Americans had hit not only primary facilities, but also secondary structures. power stations, coolant plants, ball-bearing storage sheds, and rail transfer points. The precision was unnerving. "They're learning," Gallon muttered. "Each raid. They learn." Across the room, General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, responsible for aircraft production across the Reich, lowered himself into a chair and rubbed his forehead. His staff had spent months fighting shortages of aluminum, shortages of labor, shortages of fuel, shortages of everything. Germany's industrial machine had already been strained to its limits, and now, the factories that supplied the factories had been destroyed in a single morning. Milch looked up at Yashonik. "If they continue like this," he paused, searching for the right words, "we will not be able to sustain aircraft production beyond the winter." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. But the silence was broken when a communications officer burst into the room, a stack of newly decoded American radio intercepts in hand. He whispered urgently to Yashonik, who took the papers, skimmed them, and froze. The Americans were preparing another strike. Not next month, not next week. Tomorrow. And the target was unmistakable. Regensburg. Again. Yashonik closed his eyes. The room waited. "It means," he said, his voice failing, "they are planning to grind us down, relentlessly, mathematically, until there is nothing left." Gallon spoke next, his tone cold and final. "The Flying Fortress is not a bomber. It is a strategy." What happened next? The escalation of the daylight bombing campaign, the tightening of American formation doctrine, the introduction of long-range escorts, the Luftwaffe's frantic attempts to adapt, would ignite one of the most devastating aerial struggles in human history. The B-17 would become not merely a symbol of American might, but a nightmare for German command. And in the months to come, the German High Command would witness, helplessly, as the very industrial heart of their nation was turned into ruins by an aircraft they had dismissed as exaggerated American bravado. The truth, which Berlin had refused to see, was now undeniable. The Flying Fortress was built not just to drop bombs, but to break illusions. And on that August morning in East Prussia, the illusions finally began to crack. September 1940, Berlin Reich Air Ministry. 3 years before the skies over Germany filled with the thunder of American four-engine bombers, a young intelligence officer from the Luftwaffe's technical department submitted a 32-page assessment of a new American aircraft that had just begun operational testing. The report, noted for its cautious tone, concluded, "The Boeing Model 299, now designated B-17, is impressive on paper, but tactically impractical. Its defensive armament is excessive. Its weight is unnecessary. Its reliance on formation flying is outdated. In modern air war, speed and agility decide survival." General Erhard Milch, reviewing the document late at night, scribbled a dismissive note in the margin. Americans build buses, not airplanes. At the time, the arrogance was understandable. Germany's twin-engine Do-17s, He-111s, and Ju-88s had ripped across Europe with devastating speed, supporting Blitzkrieg's lightning thrusts. The Luftwaffe's doctrine assumed bombers needed to be fast, maneuverable, and able to operate without massive escort fleets. Heavy four-engine bombers appeared outdated, a relic of First World War thinking. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Boeing engineers obsessed over an idea the Luftwaffe considered absurd: an armored, heavily armed bomber that could fight its way through enemy airspace entirely on its own. The Germans laughed. General Adolf Galland, in a briefing to fighter commanders in 1941, said bluntly, "A bomber that defends itself is a fantasy. A bomber that flies in daylight is suicide." German intelligence assessments throughout 1941 and early 1942 repeated the same conclusions. American airmen lack discipline. Their bomber crews lack experience. Their aircraft are too slow to penetrate defenses. Their industry cannot support sustained losses. The idea that the United States could mount a deep daylight bombing campaign into the heart of Europe was viewed as pure myth, a product of Hollywood optimism rather than military reality. But while German analysts laughed at the idea of a flying fortress, American engineers and industrial planners quietly prepared an air offensive of a scale the world had never seen. The first encounter, Bad Oeynhausen. Interrogation reports, 1942. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe shot down one of the earliest B-17Fs during a raid over occupied Europe. The aircraft crashed largely intact, allowing German engineers their first close inspection. The interrogation report filed at Bad Oeynhausen recorded the reactions of the technicians. One engineer wrote, "The Americans have lost their minds. 4 engines are unnecessary. The airframe is overstrengthened. Too much weight wasted on armor and guns." Another added, "This is not an aircraft. This is a fortress. They treat air war like naval war." The tone was mocking, but also uneasy. The defensive armament shocked them. 13 50 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, arranged to cover almost every angle of approach. The Germans had never conceived of a bomber designed not merely to avoid interception, but to obliterate interceptors outright. Still, senior officers dismissed the threat. At a leadership meeting in Berlin, one staff officer joked, "If the Americans want to send their factories into the sky, we will help them come back down." The joke would not age well. The first demonstrations of precision. German command remained confident until the first wave of daylight strikes revealed a shocking difference in doctrine. The American bomber crews trained not for area bombardment, like the RAF, but for precision. Their Norden bomb site, protected by obsessive secrecy, allowed trained bombardiers to achieve accuracy previously considered impossible from high altitude. When the first B-17 raids hit Rouen, Lille, and industrial facilities in occupied France in late 1942, Luftwaffe analysts were stunned by the damage reports. A secret OKL memo dated November 4, 1942, admitted, "Their accuracy is far greater than expected." If their formations reached German airspace in significant numbers, the consequences could be severe. Still, leaders in Berlin brushed off the warnings. Germany had survived far worse, they said. The American aircraft industry was supposedly inexperienced. Their pilots allegedly lacked European resolve. And the B-17 itself was repeatedly described with the same word, unnecessary. But by January 1943, it became impossible to ignore the truth. The Americans were not simply conducting raids. They were conducting rehearsals. Every attack improved their formation discipline. Every engagement taught them how to counter German tactics. Every strike refined their precision. Luftwaffe officers began tracking an alarming pattern. The B-17s were not being used randomly. They were striking the same kinds of targets repeatedly: ball-bearing factories, aircraft assembly plants, engine manufacturers, aluminum smelters, chemical and synthetic fuel facilities. It was a targeting logic Germany recognized instantly, because they had created it. The Americans were following the same industrial vulnerability models the Luftwaffe had developed in the 1930s when analyzing how to cripple an enemy economy. Only now, Germany was the subject. The turning point, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, begins by mid-1943. The United States had built enough B-17s to attempt the unthinkable, a deep strike into the heart of Germany in broad daylight, without escort capable of reaching the target. Everything German commanders had said was impossible was now being attempted, and succeeding. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt raids, intended to break German aircraft production and cripple ball-bearing output, stunned the Luftwaffe high command. Even though they inflicted heavy losses, the bombers got through. A captured B-17 pilot interrogated by Luftwaffe officers in Munich gave a chilling statement. "You can shoot down 10 of us. We will build 20. You can destroy 20. We will build 50. The officer recording the interrogation underlined the statement 3 times. It was not bravado. It was industrial mathematics. German leaders had underestimated not only the aircraft, but the nation that produced it. Inside Germany, the psychological shift begins. In late 1943, a report circulated among senior Luftwaffe staff titled Assessment of American Four-Engine Bombers and Their Impact on the War. It contained statistics the Reich had hoped never to see. The U.S. produced one B-17 every hour by mid-1943. It took Germany 3 months to build a single Ju-88. American training programs produced more bomber crewmen in 6 weeks than Germany could train in 6 months. American factories had already built more aluminum in 1942 alone than Germany would build in the entire war. The report concluded with a single devastating sentence. If the Americans continue this production rate, and if their bomber streams reach our industrial centers in sustained numbers, Germany cannot win a long war. For the first time, the Luftwaffe leadership understood. The B-17 was not the weapon. America's industry was. The Flying Fortress was merely its visible expression, a symbol of a continental economy turning raw materials into decisive power. But the greatest shock was still to come, because in early 1944, the Americans solved the final missing piece of their strategy, something German command had considered impossible since the war began: long-range escort fighters. And once the P-51 Mustang arrived, the B-17 was no longer a target. It was a hammer. A hammer aimed at the heart of German industry, and Germany would soon feel its full weight. January 11th, 1944. Luftwaffe Command Center, Berlin. Snow hammered against the reinforced windows of the operational bunker as General Adolf Galland stepped into the main briefing hall, his gloves still dusted with frost from the bitter German winter. Around the table sat the highest-ranking officers responsible for defending the Reich's airspace. Their faces were tense, their eyes exhausted from months of continuous raids. A thick stack of operational reports lay waiting in front of Galland. He scanned the first page and froze. Losses: 143 aircraft. Casualties: 88 pilots. Not for the Americans, for the Luftwaffe. The report continued. Enemy bombers sustained minimal interruption to their advance. Escort fighters remained present throughout the engagement. Defensive measures insufficient. Galland closed the folder silently. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. The event they had feared, the transformation they had warned Berlin about, had arrived. The Americans now possessed long-range escort fighters, and that single fact meant the collapse of the defensive doctrine the Luftwaffe had used since 1939. The moment everything changed, the P-51 Mustang appears. For 2 years, German pilots relied on a critical assumption. American bombers could only be escorted a short distance. Once over Germany, the B-17 formations were alone, vulnerable to coordinated attacks from every direction. It was a brutal chess match. German fighters would swarm the daylight streams of bombers, firing 20 mm and 30 mm cannon rounds into tight box formations, hoping to set fuel tanks ablaze and break formations apart. But in late December 1943, pilots from JG-26 and JG-2 began reporting a new aircraft at high altitude: long fuselage, bubble canopy, sleek wings, and a performance envelope unlike anything Germany had faced before. It was the North American P-51 Mustang, powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, capable of flying from England to Germany and back with range to spare. Luftwaffe ace Johannes Steinhoff wrote in his diary, "Today we encountered a fighter that performed like a phantom. It climbed with our best, dove faster than any of us, and could follow the bombers all the way to their targets." The Luftwaffe had lost its one strategic advantage, not in a week, not in a month, in a single day. The running culture of denial in Berlin. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Germany's leadership had often dismissed reports of American capabilities as exaggerations or temporary developments. Even when U.S. escort operations began extending deeper into France, Berlin insisted the Americans lacked fuel technology. The P-47 Thunderbolt could not sustain its range. External tanks were unreliable. Bomber streams would crumble once escorts turned back. But now the truth was undeniable. The P-51 did not turn back. It did not weaken. It did not disappear. It stayed, from the North Sea to central Germany, from takeoff to the bomb run to the return flight home. A once impossible challenge had become routine for American fighter groups. Luftwaffe doctrine crumbles under reality. For 4 years, Germany had believed in its tried-and-true tactic: attack the bombers, ignore the escort fighters. But with the P-51 present from mission start to mission end, this doctrine became suicide. Fighter units attempting to climb toward the bomber formations now found themselves intercepted at long range. Pilots accustomed to dictating engagements were now hunted, pinned, or shredded before they ever saw a B-17 in their gun sight. Luftwaffe situation reports from January-February 1944 read like a death spiral. Pilots cannot penetrate escort screen. Losses exceed acceptable thresholds. Replacement aircraft insufficient. Ammunition supply disrupted due to bomb damage. Fuel shortages critical. Training time reduced. Pilot skill degrading. German commanders were forced to confront the most devastating truth of the air war. America was not only destroying Germany's industry, it was destroying the very air force meant to protect it. The Big Week, February 20th, 1944. The final psychological blow came during Operation Argument, known to history as Big Week, a coordinated multi-day assault on Germany's aircraft industry. The Americans struck Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Augsburg, Leipzig, Gotha, Oschersleben, Stuttgart, Brunswick, and dozens of dispersed production lines. The raids were relentless. The formations were enormous. The escort coverage was overwhelming. On the second day, General Hermann Göring received a horrifying message from field commanders. We no longer control the air above our own factories. At 11:23 a.m. on February 21st, another message arrived. Enemy fighters operating over Leipzig unopposed. The implication was unthinkable. American escort fighters were not merely escorting. They were sweeping, hunting, dominating, and destroying the Luftwaffe in its own airspace. Captured German pilot accounts later described the moment they realized the battle for air supremacy was lost. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Diehl, shot down on February 25th, wrote after the war, "Everywhere we turned, there were Mustangs. They were above us, behind us, diving through our formations. Our tactics collapsed instantly." Another pilot said, "It felt like the sky had become an American possession, the mathematical collapse of Luftwaffe training." The B-17 campaign did not only destroy German factories, it also did something far more strategically devastating. It created a pilot death rate Germany could not mathematically sustain. In 1943, the Luftwaffe lost 22% of its fighter pilots, 30% of its bomber pilots. But in the first 6 months of 1944, losses accelerated to catastrophic levels. 1,600 fighter pilots killed 2,000 wounded. 2,300 aircraft destroyed. The Americans, backed by continental industry, replaced their losses with ease. The Germans could not. By late spring 1944, new Luftwaffe pilots averaged 110, 120 training hours, less than half the experience of 1942 cohorts. American pilots averaged 230, 270 hours before combat. Mustang pilots averaged even more. The mismatch became fatal. The B-17 becomes the executor of industrial war. With each passing week, bombers reached deeper. Fighter escorts expanded their radius. Germany's aircraft production, meticulously tracked by Milch, began collapsing. In March 1944, the reality became impossible to spin. Fighter production fell by 31%, bomber production by 42%, synthetic fuel output by nearly 50%. Aluminum smelting fell below wartime minimum levels. The B-17 campaign had not simply inflicted tactical damage. It had uprooted the industrial heart of Germany's war machine. General Galland made a quiet admission to his staff after reviewing March losses. "The strategic war is lost. Our pilots are dying faster than we can bury them." The nightmare Germany feared was approaching, and everyone in command knew that the next phase would be worse, because the Americans, emboldened by their dominance, were preparing something the Luftwaffe prayed would never happen: continuous saturation bombing of the Reich itself, day after day, night after night, without pause, and Germany had nothing left to stop them. March 5th, 1944. Headquarters of Luftflotte Reich, Berlin-Wannsee. A mist of cigarette smoke hung in the dim light as Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf pressed his fist onto the situation table, knuckles whitening, fatigue etched into every line on his face. Across from him, Intelligence Chief Oberst Bartholomäus Meyer slid a fresh stack of aerial reconnaissance photos across the polished wood. Stumpf flipped through them slowly. What he saw was impossible. Factories that had been producing engines, aircraft frames, ball bearings, synthetic fuels, the backbone of Germany's war machine, were now fields of twisted metal. Gotha, Augsburg, Essen, Kassel, Wilhelmshaven, Brunswick, Marienburg, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Merseburg, Gelsenkirchen, Bottrop, Ludwigshafen, Pölitz, Böhlen, Leuna, Magdeburg, Stuttgart, Hannover. Everywhere the same sight: smoke columns rising like funerals for entire industries. Stumpf shut the folder. "They are not bombing factories," he said quietly. "They are bombing the nervous system of the Reich. The Allies discover the jugular." Synthetic fuel. For years, British analysts believed Germany's weakness was fuel. The Reich had few natural petroleum reserves. Instead, it relied on synthetic conversion plants that turned coal into aviation gasoline. Plants like Leuna Böhlen, Pölitz, Gelsenberg, Brooks, Blechhammer, Scholven. These facilities produced over 90% of Germany's aircraft fuel. If they fell, the Luftwaffe fell. If the Luftwaffe fell, the Reich fell. American planners knew this. German commanders feared this. On May 12, 1944, the first major coordinated attack on fuel production began. 800 B-17s and B-24s roared across central Germany, escorted at every altitude by P-51 Mustangs. The bombs fell with mathematical precision. When the smoke cleared, 51% of aviation fuel capacity was gone. In 24 hours, the Leuna plant was burning uncontrollably. Rail yards linking fuel to frontline depots were demolished. Hydrogenation towers were split open like ruptured arteries. General Erhard Milch, responsible for aircraft production, stared at the numbers in disbelief. "If they hit fuel again," he said to Stumpf, "we will have no Luftwaffe in 6 weeks." They did. And 6 weeks later, Milch was proven right. The Luftwaffe's engines go silent. By July 1944, the consequences were catastrophic. Fighter units received 30 liters per aircraft per day. Not enough for training new pilots moved from advanced trainers to frontline combat with 0 flight hours. In a real fighter, operational squadrons flew only when absolutely necessary interceptors. Defending Berlin often scrambled with half-empty tanks. Emergency dispersal fields ran dry. Whole Jagdgeschwader wings grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Ace pilot Günther Rau later recalled, "We had aircraft on the ramp, but nothing to put in their tanks. We could hear the bombers coming and could do nothing." The B-17 had done something no weapon in history had yet accomplished. It ended a modern air force without ever shooting at it. Schweinfurt and the ball-bearing crisis. Germany's complex machinery, tanks, trucks, aircraft engines, naval turbines, relied on ball bearings from just a handful of specialized factories. The center of this network was the industrial city of Schweinfurt. It produced over half of Germany's precision ball bearings. By destroying it, the Allies could theoretically paralyze the entire German war machine. The Luftwaffe leadership scoffed at the idea in 1943. No nation can destroy an industrial center. Industry is too dispersed. By 1944, this belief was a corpse. On February 24th and 25th, 1944, the Americans returned with overwhelming force. Nearly 1,300 bombers crossed the Reich with fighter escort coverage the entire way. Within hours, machine tools were obliterated, forging mills, destroyed heat-treating facilities, flattened warehouses, turned to burning craters. 67% of production capacity lost. The psychological effect on the German command was devastating. Oberst Wilhelm Feyerabend wrote, "We had told ourselves our factories could not be destroyed. Now we watched one of our most essential industries erased in a single afternoon." The transportation system dies. If the B-17 had only hit fuel, Germany might have survived another 6 months. If it had only hit industries, perhaps more. But in May 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force made a decision that sealed Germany's fate: destroy the transportation network. They targeted rail hubs, marshalling yards, locomotive factories, bridges, inland ports, river crossings, distribution centers. In June, July, and August 1944, over 1,000 locomotives destroyed over 10,000 railcars. Burned bridges collapsed across multiple rivers, switching yards rendered unusable. The result was a mathematical catastrophe. Coal could not reach steel mills. Steel could not reach armament factories. Components could not reach assembly plants. Aircraft frames could not reach airfields. Ammunition could not reach front lines. Food could not reach cities. Germany did not simply lose production. It lost motion. A modern industrial state had become immobile. Inside the Reichsbahn collapse. By summer 1944, freight capacity had fallen by 70%. Train travel times tripled, entire rail corridors were closed for days. Steam engines sat cold for lack of coal. Replacement parts could not reach repair depots. Rail stations were filled with burned locomotives, shoved onto sidings. German intelligence reported, "America has not destroyed the rails. They have destroyed the ability to use them." The system was not damaged. It was paralyzed. German commanders confront the truth. August 1944. Headquarters. Oberkommando der Luftwaffe. Every senior commander gathered around a massive situation map of Europe. Galland spoke first. "We no longer fight for victory," he said. "We fight for delay." Stumpf added, "If fuel production is not restored, the Luftwaffe will cease to exist by winter." Milch closed his binder. "There is no fuel to restore." Silence filled the room. Outside, the air raid sirens began to wail. Minutes later, another B-17 formation passed overhead on its way east, escorted by Mustangs at every elevation layer. The generals sat motionless. The sound was deafening, relentless, a rolling metallic thunder that echoed through the concrete bunker. General Karl Kohler whispered, "We mocked these bombs. We said they could not defeat an industrial state. Now, entire cities are gone." Nobody corrected him, because it was not an exaggeration. It was reality. The B-17's terrifying evolution, precision by mass German commanders, had once scoffed at the idea of precision bombing. They called it propaganda, arrogance, fantasy. But reality was different. By mid-1944, the Americans had refined something that stunned German analysts: precision by overwhelming scale. When 12 bombers dropped bombs, the results were symbolic. When 200 bombers dropped bombs, the results were absolute. Even if only 20% struck industrial targets, the effect was catastrophic. One German report summarized it bluntly: "The concentration of bombs makes precision irrelevant." Another noted, "Where the Americans aim does not matter. They aim with entire cities." The day Germany realized the war was unwinnable. September 11th, 1944. Berlin. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel summoned Milch, Stumpf, Galland, and Koller to a closed emergency session. All four carried the same intelligence summaries. All four had reached the same conclusion. As Galland laid down the latest fuel statistics, the room went silent. Our fighter wings can no longer be deployed, he said. They exist only on paper. Milch added, aircraft production is collapsing. Our factories are being erased faster than we can relocate them. Stumpf concluded, if the bombing continues at present intensity, the air defense of Germany will cease within 90 days. Keitel nodded slowly. Then the war is lost, he said, long before the enemy reaches Berlin. The B-17 had already won it. October 7th, 1944. Stuttgart, Germany. At 11:08 a.m., the sky darkened, not from clouds, but from 1,100 incoming aircraft. B-17s, B-24s, P-51 escorts at every altitude layer. Over the city, the booming metallic heartbeat of hundreds of synchronized Wright cyclone engines pressed against the air like a physical weight. Civilians who had survived 4 years of war knew the sound intimately. It meant you had 3 minutes to go underground, maybe less. In the Führerbau bunker in Munich, General Karl Kohler, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, listened to the operational reports pouring in. Stuttgart's air raid control center was silent. The telephone lines had been cut, likely from collapsing buildings. A young signals officer handed Kohler a decrypted emergency dispatch. Primary target area obliterated. Fires uncontrollable. Request any available air support. Kohler didn't respond. Because there was none. Not a single interceptor could reach the formation. The Luftwaffe dies in the air. By late autumn 1944, the B-17 had achieved something unimaginable. It forced an entire air force into strategic extinction. Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings, that once defended the Reich with hundreds of aircraft, now existed only on paper. Their rosters recorded operational readiness, figures of 2, 4, sometimes 0 fighters. Fuel allocations had fallen to absurd levels. JG-3 received 160 liters per day, enough for 2 Bf-109s to taxi. JG-26 received 80 liters per day, enough to start an engine and shut it off. JG-52 often received nothing at all. Ace pilot Günther Rahl, then the third highest scoring fighter ace in history, later said, by late 1944, we were flying only when the situation was hopeless. Most of the time, we waited on the ground, listening to the bombers destroy our country. Even when fighters did take to the air, it was suicide. Pilots with 6 hours of total flight time, 3 of them in real fighters, were thrown into combat. Their training aircraft sat grounded in neat rows, empty tanks gleaming in the sun. German commanders begged for more fuel. There was none. It wasn't a tactical defeat. It was an industrial asphyxiation. The B-17 was not just bombing oil. It was severing the arteries of a nation. Operation Argument, Big Week, and the breaking of German morale. German officers often cited the week of February 20th, 1944, as the moment when the Luftwaffe's psychological backbone snapped. The Americans called it Big Week. The Germans called it Die Woche, in der wir starben, the week in which we died. In 6 days, 3,300 bombers attacked 10 major aircraft factories, hit 18 secondary targets, damaged ball-bearing plants, struck again fighter assembly lines, obliterated German aircraft production. Though resilient in 1944, was no longer the issue. The issue was pilots. During Big Week, Germany lost 33% of its trained fighter pilots, over 18% of its experienced instructors. More pilots died than could be replaced in 4 months. These were Germany's most valuable men, not factories, not steel, but expertise. You could build an airplane in 10 days. You could not build a fighter ace in less than 5 years. After Big Week, the Luftwaffe leadership held a closed meeting in Berlin. General Adolf Galland issued a warning. We are using the last reserves of our pilots. If this continues, the bomber stream will reach Berlin unopposed. He was mocked for pessimism. By November, the bomber stream was reaching Berlin unopposed. Cities become fuel for their own destruction. The B-17 did not destroy Germany quickly. It dismantled it piece by piece, cutting deeper with each assault. Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah. Firestorms so hot they melted asphalt, uprooted trees, and sucked people into burning streets. Temperatures reached 800 degrees C. Darmstadt, 12 minutes of annihilation, 8,000 dead. Entire residential sectors gone in a single pass. Kassel, October 22, 1943. Fiery tornadoes lifted rail cars and threw them across city blocks. Dresden, February 1945. The city was not merely bombed, it was vaporized. The B-17's firebombing capability was the result of American and British experimentation, but the true devastation came from the density of bombs, a physical phenomenon the Germans had never accounted for. One German fire brigade commander described the aftermath of Kassel. "We did not find bodies, we found shadows." The firestorms create a second civil war within Germany. The air raids did not merely destroy infrastructure, they destroyed social order. Cities descended into scenes that German commanders had never imagined possible: looting by civilians, desertion by local police, abandonment of posts by civil administrators, mothers running toward burning buildings, searching for missing children, hospitals without electricity, performing amputations by candlelight refugees, flooding roads so densely that Wehrmacht trucks could not pass. General Hans Valentin Hube wrote in his diary, "We are fighting two wars, one against the enemy and one against panic." Even hardened SS units were shaken by what they saw in bombed cities. One SS officer wrote after inspecting Essen, "This is no longer a city. It is an X-ray of a city. The skeleton only. The psychological collapse of the Luftwaffe." By winter 1944-45, pilots were experiencing a condition known unofficially as Himmelfahrtsstimmung, the mood of a suicide mission. They showed signs of trembling hands, insomnia, uncontrollable nausea, hallucinations during night scrambles, shaking before takeoff, muttering prayers on the runway. Many never returned from their final missions. They knew it. Their commanders knew it. The Americans knew it. And the B-17 formations kept coming. The Mustang makes the fortress untouchable. In 1943, the B-17 had been vulnerable. In 1944, it became something closer to invulnerable. The reason: the P-51 Mustang. With the Mustang, escort fighters could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin. German interceptors could not climb above the formation. German bombers were massacred before they reached altitude. Dive attacks became suicidal head-on tactics. Failed because Mustangs would intercept the approach. German commanders quickly realized, "We no longer fight the bombers. We fight the fighters that escort the bombers." And that fight was not going well. One Luftwaffe report stated, "The Americans have created a fortress that flies and a shield that hunts. There is no solution." The day that broke the Luftwaffe. December 31st, 1944, New Year's Eve, 1944. Germany attempted one last coordinated air operation. Operation Bodenplatte, the mass strike on Allied airfields. The goal was to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground. What happened was a massacre. 300 German aircraft lost 200 pilots killed or captured, dozens of units crippled beyond recovery. Multiple Geschwader leaders gone, irreplaceable veterans, killed by friendly fire, the Luftwaffe stripped of its last reserves. The next morning, bombers crossed into Germany again. The Luftwaffe had nothing left to send against them. The Reich's final realization. February 3rd, 1945. Berlin. 2,000 tons of bombs. One of the largest single raids of the war. The Reich chancellery shook as if struck by a meteor. The city's telephone exchanges were destroyed. Government ministries burned for days. Tens of thousands died. Inside a bunker, an exhausted officer handed General Kohler a casualty report. Kohler read it. Then, "We cannot continue the war." The B-17 had finished what the Red Ball Express began, what American fuel production ensured, what Mustangs protected, and what German industry could no longer resist. Germany was no longer fighting an air campaign. Germany was being dismantled from 25,000 feet. March 18, 1945. Berlin. The Reich's capital lay beneath a sky that no longer belonged to Germany. At 10:58 a.m., seismic vibrations rippled through the city streets as 329 heavy bombers, the largest daylight force yet assembled by the U.S. 8th Air Force, crossed into Berlin airspace. It was the final blow. Thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries fell in coordinated waves, obliterating the ministries of transport, the aviation ministry's remaining records, the Charlottenburg Industrial District key junctions of the S-Bahn government communication centers. Archive photos of Berlin that day show not a city under bombardment, but a city undergoing industrial disintegration. Inside the underground Führer bunker complex, the air raid warning sirens echoed off the concrete ceilings. Telephone operators tried desperately to keep lines open as the shockwaves cracked plaster from the walls. General Hans Krebs, the newly appointed chief of the Army General Staff, listened to the thunder above and whispered, "That is the sound of a nation ending." He wasn't wrong. The Luftwaffe's final death certificate. By spring 1945, the German Air Force had ceased to exist as a military organization. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Operational fighters, available March 1944, 1,550. July 1944, 980 September. 1944, 512 December 1944, 224 March, .45, 26. On some days, fewer than 10 fighters rose to defend the entire Reich. Fuel shortages were so severe that flight schools shut down completely. New pilots were assigned to units having never flown a real aircraft. General Galland later testified, "In the final months of the war, Germany had jet fighters, rocket interceptors, advanced prototypes, but not a single liter of fuel to fly them. The most advanced aircraft in the world sat parked and silent. Meanwhile, the B-17 formations roamed the skies at will, when bombing no longer had opposition." By April 1945, American bomber crews described missions over Germany as milk runs, a dark joke referencing dairy routes so routine that nothing interrupted them. But these milk runs delivered. The destruction of German fuel reserves, the collapse of transportation lines, the paralysis of rail movement, the starvation of entire cities, the disintegration of what remained of the war economy. The B-17 was now completing what it had begun in 1942, the systematic removal of Germany's ability to wage war at any industrial capacity. A German intelligence analyst wrote in a late April report, "We no longer measure raids in bomb tonnage, but in the loss of survival infrastructure." Inside the ruins of the Reich. As U.S. bomber formations passed overhead on their way to deeper targets, civilians on the ground were living inside a nation collapsing not just physically but socially. Scenes witnessed by surviving German administrators, children wandering, burned suburbs searching for missing parents, entire hospitals evacuating mid-surgery after power loss, fire brigades operating with horse buckets due to water main destruction, fields outside cities covered in rows of hastily dug graves, refugees walking hundreds of kilometers through bombed corridors, once massive industrial zones reduced to piles of shattered concrete. One Berlin official wrote in his diary, "We are burying a century of industrial power in a single spring. The Americans demonstrate total air supremacy." Nothing symbolized the end, like the routine sight of U.S. bombers flying at low altitude across Germany with no opposition. British intelligence recorded incidents where B-17 gunners reported days without seeing a single German fighter bomber radios carried open conversations, unheard by any German interceptors. Entire bomber groups passed over German airfields without a response. The Luftwaffe wasn't just defeated. It wasn't present. It had evaporated. The flight over Mersburg, Germany's last attempt. On April 11, 1945, the last desperate Luftwaffe defense was launched over the oil fields of Mersburg. 12 aging Bf-109s, 7 FW-190s, 4 Me-262 jets, all underfueled. They attempted to climb into a bomber stream of 400 B-17s, 200 B-24s, 150 Mustangs, 90 Thunderbolts. None of the German fighters survived more than 10 minutes. Pilot Hans Grünberg, one of the few survivors taken prisoner, later said, We climbed into a wall of fighters. The Americans did not even break formation to intercept us. Their escorts swatted us aside like insects. This was the last coordinated German air defense operation of the war. Everything after was silence. The final raids, before surrender. Even in the last days of April 1945, B-17 formations continued to strike. Munich, Linz, Salzburg, Pilsen, Zwickau, Czechoslovak industrial corridors. They didn't bomb to terror. They bombed to ensure Germany could not fight another day. A U.S. bomber commander explained, "Every bridge destroyed is one less place for the enemy to regroup. Every rail yard burned is one less month this war continues." The missions were strategic amputation. Germany was being surgically dismantled. May 1945. German generals confront the reality. After the surrender, captured generals were interrogated at Allied centers in Luxembourg, Paris, and London. The most revealing conversations centered on the B-17 campaign. General Albert Kesselring: "Our industrial war ended when you took the skies. Everything after was bookkeeping." General Adolf Galland: "Your bombers forced us into a defensive war where we had no fuel, no pilots, no airfields. We fought until we had nothing left." Field Marshal Erhard Milch: "Once fuel production was destroyed, the Luftwaffe was finished. We were not defeated tactically. We were defeated industrially." General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf: "We believed your factories could not outproduce our destruction. We were wrong by a factor of 10. General Walter Warlimont: "Germany did not fall to armies. Germany fell to production, carried by wings." These weren't propaganda statements. They were confessions, the legacy of the Flying Fortress. The B-17 did more than drop bombs. It destroyed the fuel that powered the Luftwaffe, severed the rail lines feeding the front, dismantled the aircraft industry, demolished synthetic oil and chemical plants, crushed ball-bearing production, vaporized communication networks, burned key industrial cities to their foundations, forced Germany into permanent air retreat, rendered entire regions economically dead, broke the morale of fighter pilots, shattered the myth of German invincibility. It turned the Reich into rubble, one daylight mission at a time. And it did so while demonstrating industrial superiority, logistical mastery, engineering innovation, aircrew, bravery, a level of coordination. No enemy had ever faced German commanders who once mocked the B-17 as a clumsy, slow, vulnerable giant, ended the war describing it as the hammer of an industrial empire. Another general said, "The fortress flew not only with bombs, but with the weight of America's entire economy behind it." And in the final days of the war, as Germany lay silent under Allied occupation, a captured Luftwaffe officer summed up the entire conflict in a single devastating sentence: "We prepared for your tanks. We prepared for your infantry. We prepared for your ships. But we never prepared for an enemy that could rebuild an entire air force every month." The B-17 did not win the war alone. But without it, Germany would never have fallen in 1945. It was not simply a bomber. It was a strategic instrument, designed to dismantle a modern nation from the air. And it succeeded. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you'd like us to continue telling stories like this one. Stories that deserve to be remembered.